All right, so we're diving into tradition today. Tons of research here. We're going to uncover some surprising truths about how traditions, shape our world. Everything from those heartwarming family rituals to the ones that might make you question, well, everything.
Yeah, tradition is often seen as this comforting, unifying force, like a link to our past. But what's often overlooked is that it can also be a source of conflict, even holding us back from progress.
That's a really interesting point. It seems like we often take tradition for granted without really questioning its impact on our lives. But I guess the first question is, where do we even begin? What exactly is tradition anyway?
Well, the source material defines tradition as beliefs, objects, or customs passed down through generations. And you need at least 3 generations or, about a century for something to be considered a tradition. Think of the Latin root, tradere, which means to transmit. It's like inheriting a well-worn recipe book, complete with notes scribbled in the margins by your ancestors.
I like that analogy. So it's not just about age, it's about this continuous line of transmission, this link to the past that shapes our present. But doesn't that also mean traditions can change over time as they're passed down and reinterpreted?
Absolutely. Traditions are constantly evolving, reflecting the changing values and circumstances of each generation. Take, for instance, the celebration of Chinese New Year.
Okay.
It's a tradition steeped in centuries of history, but the way it's celebrated today is influenced by modern technology and global trends.
Right, that makes sense. Even with those changes, it still provides that sense of connection to the past, to a shared cultural identity. So I guess that's one of the key functions of tradition, right? To create a sense of belonging and continuity.
Exactly. Traditions act as these social anchors, providing a sense of stability and order, especially in times of uncertainty. Imagine it like this. You're navigating a vast, uncharted ocean, and traditions are like the stars, guiding you on your journey.
Wow, I love that imagery. It really captures the idea of how traditions can provide a framework for understanding the world, a sense of direction in the face of the unknown.
Right. But here's where things get really interesting. This same sense of stability and order that traditions provide can also have a downside. It can lead to a resistance to change, even when change is necessary.
Okay, now you've got me intrigued. I'm starting to see how this paradox plays out. So how does this resistance to change manifest itself in real life? I mean, how can traditions actually hinder progress?
Well, think about scientific advancements. Throughout history, new discoveries have often been met with resistance from those who clung to traditional beliefs. For example, the idea that the Earth revolves around the sun was initially rejected because it challenged the traditional geocentric view of the universe.
That's a great example. It shows how clinging to tradition can sometimes blind us to new knowledge and prevent us from embracing progress. But it's not just about scientific advancements, is it? Traditions can also perpetuate harmful social norms, right?
Absolutely. Think about traditional gender roles, for example.
Right.
In many cultures, traditions have historically limited women's opportunities and reinforced patriarchal power structures.
So how do we even begin to untangle this complex web? How can we tell which traditions are worth preserving and which ones need to be challenged?
Well, there are different ethical frameworks we can use to evaluate the impact of traditions. Consequentialism, for instance, focuses on the outcomes of actions. So we might ask, does this tradition lead to positive or negative consequences for individuals in society?
That seems pretty straightforward. So if a tradition leads to harm or injustice, it would be considered ethically problematic from a consequentialist perspective, right?
Exactly. Now, another framework is deontology, which emphasizes the inherent rightness or wrongness of actions, regardless of their outcomes.
Okay, so even if a tradition has been practiced for centuries and has some positive outcomes, it could still be considered unethical if it violates fundamental moral principles like respect for human dignity or autonomy.
Precisely. And finally, there's utilitarianism, which aims to maximize overall happiness and well-being. So we might ask, does this tradition contribute to the greatest good for the greatest number of people?
So it sounds like we need to carefully consider the consequences, the moral principles, and the overall impact on well-being when evaluating the ethical implications of traditions. But how does this play out in real life? I mean, traditions are so ingrained in our cultures, it must be difficult to even question them, let alone challenge them.
You're right, it's definitely not easy. Traditions are often deeply intertwined with our identities, our values, and our sense of belonging. And the process of challenging traditions can be emotionally charged, even divisive.
Okay, so if traditions are so powerful, how are they even passed down through generations in the first place? I mean, it's not like we're born knowing all the customs and beliefs of our culture.
That's a great question. The transmission of tradition is a fascinating process, and it starts early on. Think about those bedtime stories you were told as a child, or the family rituals you participated in. Those seemingly simple acts are actually powerful mechanisms for instilling cultural values and norms.
So it's not just about explicit teaching. It's about absorbing these traditions through everyday interactions, through the stories we hear, the rituals we observe, the roles we see people playing.
Exactly. And psychologist Shalom Schwartz's research on universal human values points to something intriguing here. He suggests that tradition, as a value, is deeply linked to our need for security and conformity.
That's so interesting. So it's not just about external pressures to conform. There's also an internal psychological element at play. We crave that sense of stability and belonging that traditions provide, that connection to something bigger than ourselves.
Precisely. And this deep-seated psychological need helps to explain why traditions can be so enduring, even in the face of change.
So we've got these deep-seated psychological needs met by traditions, and they're passed down through these subtle everyday interactions. But, like, how have traditions actually shaped the course of history? Have they always been a force for good?
Well, the research highlights how traditions have influenced everything from family structures and governance to social interactions and belief systems. It's a mixed bag, really. Some traditions have fostered community and transmitted valuable knowledge, while others have been used to justify inequality and oppression.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can see how traditions could be used to both uphold and challenge existing power structures. But, can you give me some specific examples?
Sure. Let's start with family structures. Traditions have dictated marriage practices, family roles, and inheritance patterns for centuries. Think about arranged marriages, a tradition that's still practiced in some cultures today. While it might seem outdated or even oppressive to some, it often serves important social and economic functions within those communities.
That's interesting. So even a tradition that seems controversial to outsiders can have a deeper meaning and purpose within its cultural context. It reminds me of the Amish practice of Rumspringa, where teenagers are allowed to experience the outside world before deciding whether to commit to the Amish way of life.
Right.
It's a tradition that seems to balance respect for individual choice with the preservation of cultural identity.
Exactly. It's a great example of how traditions can evolve to accommodate changing social norms while still maintaining their core values. But let's look at another example where tradition has played a more complex role: governance. Throughout history, traditions have been used to legitimize power structures, from monarchies to social hierarchies. The concept of divine right, for instance, was a tradition that justified the absolute authority of kings and queens.
So in those cases, tradition was used to reinforce the status quo, to maintain existing power dynamics. But haven't traditions also been instrumental in movements for social change? I'm thinking of the civil rights movement in the United States, which drew upon the traditions of faith and community organizing to challenge racial segregation.
You're absolutely right. Traditions can be a powerful force for both preserving and challenging the status quo. It all depends on how they're interpreted and mobilized. In the case of the civil rights movement, activists drew upon the traditions of African American churches and communities to build solidarity, to inspire hope, and to demand justice.
So it's not about blindly following tradition for tradition's sake. It's about critically examining which traditions serve our values, which ones promote justice and equality, and which ones might need to be challenged or transformed.
Precisely. And this process of critical reflection can be applied to all aspects of life, from our personal relationships to our social institutions. Traditions can shape the way we interact with each other, the way we resolve conflicts, the way we celebrate milestones, and even the way we grieve.
That's a lot to unpack. But it's starting to make sense to me now. Traditions are like these invisible threads that weave through the fabric of our lives, shaping our beliefs, our behaviors, and our relationships. But how do we navigate this complex tapestry? How do we decide which threads to hold on to and which ones to let go of?
Well, as we discussed earlier, there are different ethical frameworks we can use to evaluate the impact of traditions. We can ask ourselves, does this tradition promote human flourishing? Does it contribute to a more just and equitable society? Does it align with our values?
Those are great guiding questions, but it seems like there's still a lot of gray area. What's considered harmful or unethical in one culture might be perfectly acceptable in another. How do we reconcile those differences?
That's a really important point. It highlights the challenges of intercultural dialogue and understanding. What's considered traditional varies widely across cultures, and what might seem strange or even offensive to one group can be deeply meaningful to another.
So how do we navigate those cultural differences? I mean, is there a universal standard for judging the ethical implications of traditions?
Well, there's no easy answer to that question. It's a complex and ongoing debate. But I think it starts with recognizing that each culture has its own unique history, values, and belief systems. We need to approach intercultural dialogue with humility and a willingness to listen to perspectives that might challenge our own assumptions.
That makes sense. It's about respecting different cultural perspectives while also holding on to our own values and principles. But how do we balance those sometimes competing priorities? I mean, how do we engage in intercultural dialogue without sacrificing our own beliefs or compromising our commitment to human rights and social justice?
It's a delicate balance for sure, but I think it's possible to find common ground, to identify shared values that transcend cultural differences. For instance, most cultures value compassion, fairness, and respect for human dignity. We can use those shared values as a starting point for dialogue and understanding.
That's a great point. So it's about finding those points of connection, those universal values that can bridge the gap between different cultural perspectives. But what about traditions that seem to directly contradict those values? Traditions that perpetuate harm or injustice. How do we address those?
Well, that's where things get even more complex. There are traditions that have been practiced for centuries, often with deep cultural and religious significance, that might seem harmful or unethical from a modern perspective. Female genital mutilation, for instance, is a tradition that's deeply rooted in certain cultures, but it's also a violation of human rights and a form of gender-based violence.
It's a really tough issue. How do we approach those kinds of traditions? I mean, is it possible to respect cultural differences while also condemning harmful practices?
It's a delicate balance for sure, but I think it's essential to engage in dialogue with those communities, to understand the cultural context of those traditions, and to work collaboratively to find alternative solutions that uphold human rights and promote well-being.
So it's about finding ways to challenge harmful practices without disrespecting cultural beliefs or imposing our own values on others. But how do we do that effectively? I mean, how do we initiate those conversations in a way that's sensitive and respectful?
Well, it starts with building trust and relationships. We need to approach these conversations with humility, empathy, and a willingness to listen. We need to acknowledge the cultural significance of these traditions while also expressing our concerns about their harmful effects.
That makes sense. It's about finding that common ground, that shared understanding that can serve as a foundation for change. But it's also about recognizing that change takes time, that it's a process that requires patience, persistence, and collaboration.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that change often comes from within. It's more effective to empower communities to question and challenge their own traditions than to impose external solutions.
So it's about supporting those who are working for change within their own cultures, providing resources and solidarity, and amplifying their voices. But what about the role of global institutions in addressing harmful traditions? Can organizations like the UN play a role in promoting human rights and protecting vulnerable populations?
Absolutely. International organizations can play a crucial role in setting standards, raising awareness, and providing support to those working to end harmful practices. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for instance, provides a framework for protecting the rights of all individuals, regardless of their cultural background.
So it's about using those international mechanisms to hold states accountable for protecting the rights of their citizens and to provide resources and support to those working to promote social change. But how do we ensure that those interventions are effective and don't backfire? I mean, how do we avoid cultural imperialism, imposing our own values on others under the guise of human rights?
That's a valid concern, for sure. It's crucial to approach these interventions with cultural sensitivity, to engage with local communities, and to work collaboratively to find solutions that are context-specific and culturally appropriate.
So it's not about imposing a one-size-fits-all solution, but rather about working with communities to identify their needs, to build capacity, and to empower them to create change from within. But even with the best intentions, there are bound to be challenges and setbacks. How do we navigate those complexities? I mean, how do we maintain hope in the face of resistance and pushback?
That's where the power of storytelling comes in. Sharing stories of individuals and communities who have successfully challenged harmful traditions can inspire hope and provide models for change. It's about showcasing the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for growth and transformation, and the power of collective action to create a more just and equitable world.
Those stories can be so powerful. They remind us that change is possible, that even deeply entrenched traditions can be challenged and transformed. But it's not just about grand narratives of social change. It's also about the small, everyday acts of resistance, the individuals who are quietly challenging norms and pushing boundaries within their own families and communities.
Exactly. Those acts of courage and defiance might seem insignificant on their own, but they collectively contribute to a shift in consciousness, to a gradual dismantling of harmful traditions, and a reimagining of what's possible.
I'm starting to see how all of these threads connect, how individual actions, cultural shifts, and global movements all contribute to the ongoing evolution of tradition. But as we move further into the 21st century with rapid technological advancements and increasing globalization, what does the future hold for traditions? I mean, are they destined to fade away, or can they adapt and thrive in the modern world?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And the answer, as with most things related to tradition, is complex and nuanced. While some traditions are undoubtedly struggling to survive in the face of rapid change, others are proving to be remarkably resilient and adaptable.
So it's not a uniform trend of decline. There's hope for traditions to not only survive, but to flourish in the modern world.
Absolutely. Traditions are not static relics of the past. They're living, breathing entities that are constantly evolving and adapting to new circumstances. And as we've seen throughout history, traditions have an incredible capacity for reinvention and transformation.
So traditions are constantly evolving and adapting. But what does that actually look like? Can you give me some examples of how traditions are successfully navigating these modern challenges?
Of course, think about the rise of online religious services and virtual pilgrimages. These are modern adaptations that allow people to connect with their faith traditions in ways that were unimaginable just a few decades ago.
Wow, that's a great example. It shows how technology can actually help preserve and even revitalize traditions. But it's not just about technology, right? I mean, aren't there also examples of traditions evolving organically through cultural exchange and adaptation?
Absolutely. Take the evolution of yoga, for instance. It originated in ancient India as a spiritual practice, but it's been embraced globally and adapted to fit a wide range of modern lifestyles and fitness goals.
That's a really interesting case study. It shows how a tradition can retain its core essence while also evolving to meet the changing needs of a global audience. But what about the potential for traditions to lose their authenticity in the process of modernization or globalization?
That's a valid concern, and it's something we need to be mindful of. There's always a risk of traditions becoming commodified or diluted as they're adapted for mass consumption.
So how do we strike that balance? How do we ensure that traditions evolve in a way that's both authentic and relevant to the modern world?
I think it's about finding ways to honor the essence of a tradition while also allowing it to, breathe and grow. It's about recognizing that traditions are not static artifacts, but living expressions of human culture that need to adapt to survive.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But it also sounds like a delicate process. I mean, who gets to decide how a tradition evolves, and how do we prevent traditions from being exploited or misused for political or economic gain?
Those are really important questions. And there's no easy answer. It often comes down to a process of dialogue, negotiation, and compromise within communities.
So it's about finding ways to engage in respectful and constructive conversations about the future of traditions, recognizing that there will be different perspectives and sometimes even disagreements.
Exactly. It's about embracing the complexity and messiness of cultural evolution, recognizing that there's no one right way to preserve or adapt traditions.
This whole conversation has really made me think about the traditions in my own life, the ones I cherish, the ones I question, and the ones I might want to let go of. It's made me realize that tradition is not just about the past. It's about making conscious choices about what we want to carry forward into the future.
That's a beautiful insight, and it speaks to the power we all have to shape the future of traditions. We're not just passive inheritors of the past, we're active participants in the ongoing process of cultural evolution.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought to ponder. What are the traditions you value most? How are those traditions evolving in your own life? And what role do you want to play in shaping the future of traditions for generations to come?
That's a wonderful challenge to leave our listeners with, to be active participants in the shaping of tradition, not passive inheritors.
This is DigitView.